we were talking about what it was that generates a desire for, a need for professional standards from within professions. I mean, there's all kinds of perspectives you can take on this, but what I wanted to sort of begin focusing attention on was the question about why professionals themselves would have some interest in establishing guidelines, standards, codes, whatever you like, for professional behavior. And I think we left off having suggested there are at least a couple. The self-interest of the professionals themselves, and I'm not sure whether I labeled this other area in exactly this way, but service to society or to the community, that's another thing that might motivate the professionals themselves to establish certain guidelines. I mean, because professionals are, not only concerned with making money, they're also concerned with contributing something to the world, and contributing to society. And so that's another motivator that may lead to creation of standards. Now, some of these may be recognizably ethical or moral. Others may be practical. Still others may have to do with levels of competency. I'm not sure whether this came out explicitly earlier on, but let me bring it out now. For example, when we're looking at standards of competency in professions, we might think, and I think we would be right in this, I don't mean to deny it, we might think that first and foremost, the idea that doctors or lawyers or engineers should be competent, that first and foremost, that serves the interests of the community, of the larger society, of we, the consumer of their services. Now, surely that's true, but there are also lots of ways in which it serves the self-interests of the professionals themselves. To the extent that doctors or lawyers or engineers are perceived as being part of an elite, that enhances their prestige, for one thing. And that can be something that would be in the self-interest of the professionals themselves. Also, to the extent that it would be difficult to achieve the degree of educational sophistication, for example, in one of these professions, like in medicine or in law, to the extent that it's expensive or difficult to get that degree of expertise, why then the interests of the professionals may be served by limiting the number of people that they have to compete with out there. So even some of the things that seem first and foremost to be to yield benefits to society at large, there may also be some ways in which those very same standards serve self-interests of the professionals. So I want to emphasize that these are not completely exclusive sorts of categories. There's a lot of overlap and intermixing. But these may lead professionals themselves to desire or to try to create or establish some sort of guidelines or standards for their behavior. Some of them might be ethical looking, and others of them might not be. And then another thing that needs to be mentioned, sometimes you might see them actually set down in codes or on paper, and other times it might just kind of be tacit agreements among professionals about how they should behave toward one another, how they should behave toward other members of society. But that's kind of where we left off, as I recall. Self-interest might be measured in terms of prestige or power, economic well-being, A lot of other categories could be thrown in there. And then the social service aspect is not to be neglected. As I say, the professionals themselves often are motivated by a variety of different things, and one of them is to make some sort of contribution to society. Professionals are often very proud of their ability to do this, and I don't think that this should be neglected or underestimated. This time, though, I wanted to sort of touch on something that's a little more subtle, and it's something that it's kind of hard to see if we stay at this same abstract level of discussion that we've been at before. But I want to try out a few questions on you. I'm not sure how well this is going to work, but let me try out a few questions and see what kinds of answers you're inclined to give. Now, I want kind of just top of the head answers to start with, and then we can pursue them a little deeper if we need to afterwards. But if I were to ask you, how should a professional behave as a professional, what kind of answers would you be inclined to give? Now remember, I'm asking a fairly general question. What constraints ought there to be on professional behavior insofar as it's professional? How should professionals behave? Now, you're maybe inclined to say, a professional what? I'm going to get to that in a few moments, but let's just try it in this abstract way at first. Anybody?
Not to take advantage of their clientele?
Not to take, a professional should not take advantage of clientele. How do you define clientele?
The people he's providing service, he or she is providing service for.
Now, this presumes, and I want you to notice that, this presumes that the professional in question is a service provider. I mean, are there no professions wherein service isn't really the key, or isn't really definitive? Are there no solitary professions? How about professional athletes, especially in sports where it's not a matter of teams? I mean, professional, like I don't know, I'm thinking of mountain climbers. I'm not sure that they're very well paid, but I mean, I'm trying to think of somebody that might be engaged in something that you would at some level be inclined to call professional, but which really doesn't call for service of any kind. How about anything else that it's a perfectly legitimate. What we're doing is focusing on the service aspect, but that may not be there all the time.
Sort of limit outsiders to their knowledge.
Professionals should?
Yeah.
Okay, should limit their...
to their own. Professionals should limit anybody outside of their organization to the knowledge that they have.
They should keep them from gaining it. Is that the idea? What is your thought? I mean, this is just sort of a general...
Yeah, general.
Why?
So that they'll be viewed as something higher.
Okay, so that you're suggesting that one kind of common standard might be to preserve the prestige of the profession. And indeed, in the history of almost all the professions, there's been a good deal of mystification for reasons of the self-interest of the professionals, perhaps. I'm looking for something that's a little bit trickier than that, and I think maybe we have to ask, we can't just ask about professionals, and so let me ask you to start with, how should a doctor behave? Let's just focus on one right now. I mean, what are some things that should guide the behavior of doctors? I mean, things that you might expect to be in a medical code of ethics or medical standards of professional behavior.
Is concerned for his patients.
Should be concerned for patients. Well, that's something that's along the lines of the one that you recommended for professionals altogether. Let's be more specific. Can you think? Yeah.
You shouldn't wear the clothes you're wearing. Or you should wear something.
Why is that? You're thinking of some good ones, but they're not the kinds of ones. They're not the ones that I'm prepared to hear. I think they're neat.
Why is it?
Why would you wear a uniform
Why would you wear it?
or some special garb?
to sort of let the patient know that your standards are, that you have certain standards that are met.
Prove that you're competent by wearing the particular uniform that goes with your. Well, I mean, I think that there is a sense in which you identify yourself as a professional of a certain kind by wearing a certain garb, and that becomes important in some professions. Perhaps not so important in others, but maybe in the medical profession, that's another one that's important. Yeah.
Maybe being a doctor, keeping, I don't know, like your bills down. Like instead of billing people at such an outrageous price, so everyone could afford service that
Again,
the
but
doctor
part of the idea that the doctor should care for patients and be more concerned with that than with making money. Yeah, you might. I mean, I think that these are some of the expectations or hopes that we have of medical profession. Let's go to another profession, though. I mean, we're talking about patients here. What should attorneys do? What should guide the behavior of attorneys?
They should have confidence in themselves,
They should have. Okay, and why is that?
because their client will see that in them and they'll put that forth, like, while they're on a case or whatever. If they don't have confidence in their job.
So as to better represent the client, you're imagining that, for example, it's a defense attorney, or you're imagining that this is a lawyer who brings cases actually to court. Not every lawyer does that, but you're imagining that having a certain bearing will be important in the presentation of the case, will be important in making the right kind of representation of the client. Now, what does that presuppose about an obligation of the attorney? I mean, let me go on to you, but think about that. What were you
There
going to
should
say?
be the, in case of a lawyer, there should be the confidentiality, and a doctor too, between client and doctor or lawyer.
So they should preserve confidentiality. Why?
Because, I mean, obviously, if you're going to this person, lawyer, if you need help, you don't really want the whole problem broadcast, to everyone. If you wanted to do that, you just went to the newspapers.
Okay. Well, we're talking about professions in which this idea of service, not only to society now, but service to clients, is certainly these professions play these are a very important part of the way we understand these professions and these professionals. How about some? I mean, I'm not sure how many people we have in here who are training to be doctors or lawyers. How about examples from your own life? What it is to be professional, whatever it is. Yeah.
Just to be well read as far as new material that's coming out, as far as doctors are concerned, to understand the latest treatments and to have that knowledge.
And perhaps, in any profession, there is something like an obligation to maintain your expertise as the profession may change and adapt. What is it to be a good engineer? What should engineers do? Think about it. I'm not sure I need specific answers, but there are things that even non-engineers can say, oh, well, I guess an engineer, it depends on the engineer, but they should, they're builders by and large. They should be careful of the materials that they work with. They should try to make sure that whatever it is that they produce for people does the job that it's supposed to do, so there's a certain kind of faith and service to clients. How should a mechanic behave, a professional mechanic? What I'm getting at here is that while there are lots of questions that we can answer, and we've sort of gone back and forth between two different styles of answers. One kind of answer is perfectly general. We could say the same thing for any professional. For example, the answer that says you should stay on top of your field. That's a guideline that perhaps professionals in all professions should follow. They should try and learn state-of-the-art techniques to the extent that they can, stay on top of it. They should, to the extent that they have clients, they should be true to their clients. To the extent that they serve society, they should provide service to society. But then once I start doing this, to the extent that stuff, I begin to point out, I begin to allude to the fact that different professions have sort of different objectives. And when we start going into the details of particular professions, we might find out some interesting things about how the internal logic of a profession sometimes determines certain ways that a professional should be, certain guidelines for professional behavior. So that, for example, what is a doctor? Well, a physician, a doctor, not just any old medical person, but a physician or a doctor is defined as someone who takes care of patients. So, of course, part of the internal logic of being a physician means certain things about how professionals should behave. How about, though, professional criminals? Again, this is an area in which I have to warn you, lots of people who talk about professional ethics really don't want to use the term professional except in connection with the professions that we approve of. I'm personally not convinced that there's any good reason for doing that. It seems to me that we talk perfectly reasonably about professional criminals, about professional prostitutes, about professional all kinds of things that we might not approve of. But for professional criminals, just like for these other professions, there are internal standards that you could kind of understand. Well, I mean, the professional criminals, if they're working together, shouldn't betray one another, right? And I think when you start thinking about things like that, you'll begin to see how rich the area is within which professional standards, professional codes of behavior get created. There's lots of stuff that's devoted to the things that you have in mind about service to the community, loyalty to clients, confidentiality, good service to people. But there's also interesting stuff like the things that you're pointing out, like maintaining the prestige and the social status of professionals vis-a-vis others, maintaining secrecy, maintaining protection over information, which, if other people got it, they might be able to provide these services more cheaply. They might be able to compete with us. There's all kinds of different motivations for the standards which either explicitly or implicitly get picked up and used within professions. Interestingly enough, the history of organized crime, which goes back to the Spanish Garduna in the 15th century, shows that this is a group of people who are professionals. They have a code of ethics, a code of behavior. They were supposed to stand up to torture, even if, I think the wording was, even if you're being drawn and quartered. It was part of the professional code of ethics of the Spanish Garduna, of the ancestor of the Mafia and the Cosa Nostra, this organization in Spain. You weren't to tell. And if you don't understand that there's something that draws people, it's not just we're going to go into it a little bit more next time, but it's not just self-interest, like money, and nor is it for sure community service. Something else motivates standards of behavior. Something motivates standards of behavior that are upheld at great personal cost to this day in gangs and inner cities. There are standards of behavior among people that are upheld at great personal cost. People will go to the wall to uphold the standards.
I don't know whether it stands in a professional way. You know how you have families. It's more of a crime. It's more of an intimate thing than a everyone's involved thing.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. Can you clarify how that applies to what we're...
Just the fact that I do see a separation between a professional criminal and a professional service, someone rendering a service.
There could be no doubt that they're very different, but
Right,
it's one
and
more
to
professional.
put them under one word, professional, I think is...
Okay,
it
so
confuses me, I think.
you don't. All right. So you think that the word professional, I mean, you would
it's
be
too broad in this sense.
Mhm. Well, how would you define it?
I think... I don't really know.
I mean, would it be in terms? I mean, would it have service packed in or something?
It's pretty somehow, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the criminals are providing a service. They're keeping policemen in business, but that doesn't really come under a professional role.
Well, there's a lot of people who've given a great deal of thought to this who agree with you. I mean, whose view it is that when we speak of professional criminals, we're sort of abusing the word professional. That we're stretching it beyond its real meaning. And its real meaning is to be tied more closely to service.
This is my opinion, of course.
I know.
I mean, say even in a doctor's role, I mean, a doctor, is it in his professional interest, can I use that word interest?
Yeah.
Yeah, in his professional interest to perform triage. say like Dr. Kevorkian.
Explain triage.
To really decide who should die and who should live. Dr. Kevorkian is probably a fantastic doctor and can cure me of bronchitis in 2 days, but is it his decision to see who dies?
Maybe you're. I got confused. I think when you brought in the word interest, but you mean,
that's
is he
where I'm
making?
confused.
When
I mean, is it his interest?
Let me ask you this question. Is it? Let's speak about Kevorkian. Is he acting as a professional?
Yes.
You want to know when he makes decisions to assist people in their
Well,
suicides.
these might be great decisions. I don't know.
But there's is that the question?
That's along the lines of what I'm saying. I mean, is it and what I'm saying is, I think the way professional is being used is way too broad. I think that there are professionals, and I think maybe they're insulted by the way it's so broad. I don't know.
Good as I recall, it was you who, when I
True,
talked about
yes,
professional
I think
criminals.
I'm talking myself out of that.
But that's a place where you and I disagree. But I want you to know that you're on your side, or
Well,
a
I
huge
don't
portion.
too much.
Yeah, but I mean, on that side, whether it's yours or not, on that side are an awful lot of the people in the field of professional ethics who think that we should be very, very cautious not to use this word professional, at least not for professional criminals.
I think professional things have been tested. New things may not be professional yet. Later on down the line, they will become professional.
Well, I'm talking about the Spanish Garduna. I mean, this is an interesting. This is not just an argument between you and me. I mean, I think that this is a key. This is a key point that requires our attention anyway, because it illuminates whichever side of this debate you fall on. I think it sheds a lot of light on ethics within the profession, about standards in general in the profession, how many of them are likely to be really moral in our normal sense, and why it is that there sometimes appears to be a battle over control over professional codes of ethics from, on the one side, members of the profession who may or may not anymore value the code of ethics that's attached to their profession, and then us outsiders on the other. We want that code of ethics to speak to our interests. But to the extent that people within the profession continue to care about their professional codes of ethics, the interests of outsiders are not necessarily paramount. I don't want to say that they are to be ignored. I think people within the professions often care very much about the interests of outsiders, the interests of society at large. Interestingly enough, a novel detail about the Spanish Garduna is that they, in their code of ethics, one of the things that's important is that professionals are supposed to maintain loyalty, confidentiality, not only with regard to one another, but with regard to clients, because the Spanish Garduna was a professional organization, I claim, that hired out its services to kings, to popes, to all kinds of people during that time. And there was a very rigid code of ethics that said that they should maintain confidentiality and faith with the clients who hired them. Like if they were hired to commit a murder or a robbery, they should go to their deaths, not revealing who it was that hired them. It's a service organization too. Maybe not a service organization that we would understand to be serving the best interests of society at large, but they did care about their clients. But I find it, let me just summarize my position on this issue about what's a professional and what's not by saying that you say that I've been using it overly broadly. I don't see any non-question begging way of narrowing it any further. It seems to me that I don't see why we, apart from just asserting it to be true, we shouldn't allow the word professional to be used to describe criminals as much as anybody else. It seems more important, and there's a lot of different things that go into it, but much more important in deciding who's a professional and who isn't, it seems to me, is the factor of competence at a difficult task. Competence at a very difficult task, something that not everyone can do. Now, we can have arguments about who's competent and who's not, and we can have arguments about what really is difficult and what's not. But once we've settled those arguments, it seems to me that the key idea behind professionalism, and professions usually involves some reference somewhere to competence at a difficult task. And that's the one that I sort of see as fundamental to the whole area. But to get back to the general question about how doctors should behave, how lawyers should behave, how criminals should behave, how mechanics should behave, I guess the key thing that I wanted to emphasize today is that while we can answer some of these questions quite generally, in terms of sort of professionalism across all of these different fields, there's other things that we will be able to say concerning the behavior of professionals only when we know which profession we're talking about. There's a certain logic to being a doctor. It requires certain sorts of things. People who would use the knowledge that they got in medical school to systematically dismantle every patient that came in the door would not be behaving professionally. They would not be behaving as doctors. I mean, that's not a way to be a doctor, is to simply take people apart as soon as they walk in the door. The part of being a doctor is to be serving those people, the interests of the people who come in, the health needs of the people who come in the door. And the same way for all the other particular professions. Once we know what the profession is, we learn about what might be called I'm going to use the word logical here. Logical features of the particular professions. This is a point that goes back to Plato's Republic, actually. He was concerned with trying to figure out what a statesman did. You know, what was it that a statesman should be, the leader of a country. And one of the people he was talking to thought that the main job of a statesman was to dominate people and to make as much money as possible. A question or an answer that's comparable to saying that the main job of a doctor is to make as much money as possible, or a lawyer to gain as much power to make as much money as possible. And what Plato's response is no. Insofar as a statesman is a statesman, there are certain interests that the job dictates, and that has to do with running the country well. And insofar as a doctor is a doctor, the primary activity of being a doctor involves helping people get well or preserve their health. And similarly for every profession. And you can find these features in crime, in anything you can name. I mean, any difficult activity you can name will have its own internal logic and will therefore dictate things that people should do if they undertake that activity. And that's a very important factor in giving content to standards of behavior that may later emerge in professional codes of ethics. And of course, there are lots of the jobs, the businesses, the professions that we focus our attention on that have right in their central core some such thing as service. I don't deny that lots of professions do. I only deny that all of them do. But one could go on. How should a businessman behave? I mean, depending how you understand, I mean, that's a fairly, usually that's another generic term. It's a term we use quite readily, but businessmen usually do specific pieces of business. They have particular services or that they provide or things that they sell. So we would want to know more details in order to get substance to our answer to this question. But a lot of people would say that business itself, conducting business in an environment, say, like the one in Wall Street, produces certain standards of excellence. we may approve of some of these things and we may not. I'm sort of sorting these issues in the way I'm doing it because I want to focus attention on the difference between saying that something is professional or part of a profession or a standard that is natural to a profession, separate that from saying it's good, it's valuable, we like it, we think it should be encouraged. That's a whole different set of questions. So these questions, these logical features of the particular professions, they vary from profession to profession. They are closely related to understanding just what the profession is. You can find people having arguments about what the logical features of a particular profession may be, but what they're then arguing about is just what it is to be such a professional, what that profession really is. Yeah.
Really professional, I would think, is what someone considers himself. So if someone, say, took a job as a manager and didn't want to be a manager to begin with, they may not call themselves a professional because they didn't take pride in that job. You know, I think to be a professional, you have a goal from the beginning. Say to be a doctor, you wanted to be a doctor since you were 15. You consider yourself a professional.
I don't know that it requires that long term, but let me say a resounding yes to one thing there. People who are, for example, trained in a field but then find themselves unable to get, I mean, let's say I'm a professional philosopher, but there was a period of time, not long, but there was a period of time when I was not working. As a matter of fact, I was in the Army. Hated it. So that's a bad example because it was the Army. But I mean, there's a lot of times when people are trained in one thing, they come to hate it. Or people who are trained in one thing but don't get a job in it, they're working somewhere else and they don't consider that their profession.
I mean, just for example, I worked, say, with a garbage thing over the summer.
Yeah.
Everyone I worked with who was there for 30 years didn't consider themselves a professional garbage collector.
Well, was it real tricky?
It was, I mean, there's a lot of buttons to press.
I know, but it was, I mean, is it something that requires considerable skill at a difficult task? I bet that
It depends on what level of
garbage.
professional.
Yeah. Well, I would think that there are people who come closer to being professionals than not, depending more than anything else.
And that's where I think the term is used too broadly.
I'm trying to pin it down to involving in some way, shape, or form competence at a difficult task. And I would guess that when people don't regard themselves as professionals, there can be a lot of different reasons for that. One of them might be that they don't think that involves much skill.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah.
And other people might disagree with them. And then deciding, there's so many. I mean, I don't want to say that.
But what I'm saying is, does someone else say you're a professional? Do you consider yourself a professional? I think it's.
I don't think either makes. I don't think either makes it happen.
Okay.
I think it involves. I mean, if you would have to have, in order to be a professional at something, you would have to have some competence at a difficult task, and so that wouldn't be just because you thought so or because someone else thought so. You have to really be competent.
Where I used to work, they have like they say the professional staff, which is like the upper division of the staff. But then there's also people underneath them that are in charge of other people. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And they expect those people and the people underneath them to act professionally. So why is there just a certain few that are considered the professional staff, and they're the minority out of the whole entire?
Well, they are being. The claim is that, I mean, and again, there's other interesting ramifications of this in the real world, but the claim is that these are the people that are most competent at whatever difficult task it is that is being done in that particular place. What's intriguing is that you'll find, maybe even more often than not, I don't know, but it's incredible how often the people who are in the lower positions are frequently, just because of perhaps because of the present economic situation, but they're often much more highly trained at something or other than the people who are supposedly the professional staff.
And also,
It's just that these lower people can't get jobs in their professions, or that there's no openings, so there's no place for them to move. And so there will be these really odd, arbitrary distinctions between the professional staff and the non-professional staff. The claim what's being bought with the use of that term, or what is being, people were, I mean, go on and on. But what the attempt that is being made is to buy a certain kind of respect, and it's what's being traded on is the contention, maybe not real, but the contention that the professionals are more competent than the non-professionals in some specified task. The trappings of professionalism. I mean, for example, you think about uniforms. A thing that I'm only recently becoming adjusted to myself is the wearing of ties to assert authority. That people will expect that because they dress in a certain way, you're supposed to pay them a certain regard because they're dressed that way, I guess, or at least that's supposed to be a sign of their greater expertise. There's something like this that goes on in a great variety of parts of our lives. In the professions, that's one of the things that the whole idea of professional is supposed to evoke, is a respect by virtue of the competency of the professional in something that's relatively esoteric, something that not everyone can do. What the reason I'm interested in the things you say is that this actually comes up in what you're pointing out as well about the place you work. Often there are attempts to evoke the whole superiority, inferiority, the entire idea of expertise, to invoke that, whether or not it really exists, whether it really is there. The idea is to invoke it, to get us to behave in certain ways, or to encourage, maybe better behavior on the part of professionals. I mean, to call a person a professional may be something that is done for a positive reason, to pump them up, to make them think more highly of themselves, to make them feel more responsible. You professionals, I mean, I want to talk to you professionals. I don't want to talk about those others. I mean, it's a we-us kind of thing, too. The professionals are admitted into the clique of those who are good at doing certain sorts of things. The factor that seems to me key throughout is this idea of competence at difficult tasks. And when we're asking, how do professional codes of standards of behavior, whether they are written down someplace or whether they're just kind of tacitly accepted by members of the in crowd, how do they emerge? And what I'm trying to suggest to you, that there's a variety of sources. I've put some category names around some of them. Last time we talked about self-interest of the professionals themselves. We talked also about service to the community, service to clients. This time I'm trying to talk about factors that emerge from the logic of the job that's supposed to be done. The logic of just what it is that the professional is up to. What doctors ought to do as doctors is different from what ship's captains or lawyers ought to do, just because these are different jobs. The job dictates what they should do. And you can see that this isn't just a service issue, because housebreaker, the crook that could break a vault in whatever, couple seconds and get away scot-free, the one that you mentioned a few classes ago. There are internal logical standards that are implicit in that activity as well. It would help, and it would help you understand why particular codes of behavior might emerge between the practitioners in that field. And that's what we're trying to do, figure out where do these things come from. And that's a different, and we should not expect to find that we like everything that emerges from such settings. And that will be illuminating too. So community service may or may not enter into these sort of internal logical questions about professions. It depends on the profession. Some professions just are devoted to service. Other ones aren't or need not be. The professionals will often see themselves as a doctor or lawyer. They understand themselves. Their personal self-image sometimes is coupled with they see themselves as someone who does, someone who acts in a certain way, not just a person with a certain height and a certain hair color, but a person who's a dynamic understanding of a person in terms of what they do, perhaps also in terms of what they value. All of these things are important. And I guess what I want to lead up to is the topic for next time. It's a last criterion. Again, these things overlap. It's not criterion. A last factor that enters into the creation of standards for behavior among professionals, among groups of all kinds, but among professionals too. I guess the best word for it, it's one I've used before, romantic factors. I'm beginning to hint at some of them here at the end of what I was just saying a few moments ago. But some of what goes into the professional's understanding of herself, of himself, professional understanding of how they should behave, has to do with neither self-interest, service to society, logical features of the profession itself, but something akin to romance, something that's attractive in that way. And again, this is common not just to professional groups, but to groups of all kinds. It's the romance of the gang, the romance of the outlaw. We could come to understand mores of all kinds of groups in terms of a romantic attraction that draws people. I don't mean to say that. Certainly don't mean to say that's limited to professional groups, but it's there too. And you won't. And I don't think we'll understand. We won't understand why professionals see their professions the way that they do unless we see that as a property as well. So between now and then, I hope you'll reflect a little bit on why it is that you are heading in whatever professional direction you're heading. That's a good question. I think for a lot of us, I remember switching majors a number of times when I was in college. I'm not sure that you have quite the same opportunity to do that anymore, but it used to be quite common that people would switch majors 5 times in the course of an undergraduate career. But the interesting question to ask is, seeking what? It wasn't always in the direction of more money. It was almost always in some direction that, again, I think is best understood in terms of some kind of an attraction, something, oh, I really want to do that. This is something that really looks neat. And you don't understand the professions, I think, unless you understand that factor as well. Any questions, comments, objections, rude remarks, knock-knock jokes?